Hi, I'm Ryan Szimanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial.
Hey, wrong channel, Chief.
Sorry, somebody pointing a camera at me. I just go into autopilot.
Ryan, it's good to see you again. Months for the audience, minutes for us. It's okay. Yeah, that is a wonderful shirt still.
Thank you.
Yeah, you've been wearing it for the last 3 months. 4, however long it's been.
It doesn't even smell yet.
Okay, so a couple episodes ago, we did favorite battleship and what battleship might you have liked to seen as a museum.
Mm-hmm.
How about let's do cruiser today? So, favorite cruiser could be USN, doesn't necessarily have to be. We'll break it into a couple parts. So, favorite cruiser, museum, not museum, and then favorite non-USN cruiser, museum, maybe not a museum. For the sake of the video, and the sake of time, let's just do cruiser. So not necessarily, so it doesn't have to be heavy, it doesn't have to be light.
Okay.
So just whatever comes to the top of the mind, we can talk about that.
Alaska.
No, no large cruisers. That very first episode of Alaska will always be permanently scarred to us, because not only was that quite annoying, but the reaction was quite funny too. Yeah,
They're such beautiful ships, though. I love that.
Yeah, for just being bigger Baltimores, they are pretty. They are good. They are good-looking ships. However, you cannot say Alaska. I am just you are not allowed to talk about Alaska on this. No more Alaska. So heavy and light.
Like one each?
No.
Okay, just one.
That's what you have to choose from. You don't get large or battle, depending on what country you're talking about.
So there's a goofy answer and there's a true answer.
Oh, let's have both.
Okay. So
I like goofy.
There is a broken part of me that absolutely loves the Omaha class cruisers.
Oh, Lord.
4 stacks is the ideal number of smokestacks for a ship to have. First point.
I knew you were going to say Omaha.
But more importantly, they were designed to escort my beloved Lexington-class battle cruisers.
Okay.
But before there was World of Warships, back when I was a kid...
Where in World of Warships, Omaha is just food for literally everything else.
And I won't say it isn't in this game either. But before there was World of Warships, there was Navy Field.
Okay.
And that's what I grew up with in grade school, playing Battle Stations, Midway and Pacific, and Navy Field. And Omaha's about as far as I made it in that game. And it was not a great ship, but I spent hours and hours grinding Omaha. And
Well, it's funny because so in World of Warships, technically, like if you started from base 0, a person who was totally not like who had some video game experience in one night could get to Omaha. And so that's what's usually funny about it is like
so you're already in this mid-level cruiser with like 0 experience.
So yeah, so you typically when you see an Omaha in game, that person is not playing Omaha because they like Omaha. It's because that's where they are at the moment, and that could be their very first night of actually playing this game. And someone who's been playing since 2015 right, in beta, you're like, oh, okay, that's just food, and then you just flick it, it detonates into 1,000 pieces, and then
By design, the armor on that ship is not great at all. Nor the armament layout.
We did on the channel. This would have been back in July. We did the the Battle of Komandorsky Islands.
Ooh, okay.
In a short course video. I'll link it back up there if you find it. But in that video, you had USS Richmond, CL9, I think it was, or
would you call Richmond your hometown?
no.
Okay.
No. So Richmond's in the South. I live in Northern Virginia, outside of DC. But then, so Richmond is the flagship. And then you have heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, which is a Pensacola class heavy cruiser.
Swayback Maru, an equally unfortunately designed ship.
And I'm sorry, but even though both ships have their issues, if I was an admiral, my flag would be on Pensacola, or in this case, Salt Lake City, before Richmond.
But the Omahas were set up to be destroyer flotilla flagships. And I can't say off the top of my head whether the Pensacola's had any flag capabilities.
Who knows? I personally don't, but obviously there must have been a reason.
Even if you're standing on the open bridge out in Alaska, you'd rather be on Salt Lake City.
So in the Battle of Komandorsky Islands, as the battle kicks off, which the Japanese are attacking with Maya, which is an Otago class cruiser, and Nachi, which I believe is a Myoko.
Arguably two of the very best cruisers in the world at that time.
And so the admiral on board Richmond is like, we will conform to the he sends a message to Salt Lake City, we'll conform to your movements, and then here you go. And subsequently, Salt Lake City, the heavy cruiser, ends up doing most of the actual battle, because it's like, I can't afford to take a bunch of Japanese 8-inch shells in my flimsy Omaha.
I mean, you're not even in range with your flimsy Omaha.
No,
forget that.
And even if you were in range, the casemate guns on the wing.
Yeah, half your guns are useless. Half your guns are useless.
And then those little turrets in the front and the back. The ships are disasters. I'm sorry. Okay, so you're going with favorite cruiser out of everything. So that's your dented answer, Omaha.
There's a part of me that absolutely loves those ships. Much like there's another equally as broken part of me that loves the Alaskas. Growing up, I always loved the Baltimore class. I'm from Baltimore originally.
Sure.
Which is part of why I was asking you about your hometown class. So there's a part of me that really loves the Baltimores, and those were good-looking ships too. But they didn't really get into any really great standout battles.
Well, Baltimore is the workhorse in not only in practice, but in design, because as we discussed in our Alaska video, Alaska is derived from Baltimore. And then Baltimore obviously becomes Oregon City, which then becomes Des Moines. And so Baltimore,
we both love us Des Moines and Salem in particular.
Right. So Baltimore is this key class of ship, and you don't get any other USN cruiser without Baltimore, or heavy cruiser, or large cruiser in this case. So Baltimore. I
want to say Baltimore because of that association, and because I grew up watching the movie In Harm's Way, filmed in St. Paul, John Wayne, Kirk Douglas. So I love the footage of this modified Baltimore class cruiser, post-war modified. But really, I think my favorite cruiser class of all times has to be the Clevelands.
Now, with that being said, you just visited a Cleveland class cruiser, or at least what's left of a Cleveland class
a very heavily modified Cleveland.
So is that good enough? So as sort of the could you, if you picked a ship to preserve as a museum, is having USS Little Rock around enough to fulfill that? Or would you like to see a Cleveland as it was in World War II, with all the main battery and everything, versus being picked apart, rearranged, and having missiles glued onto it, and whatever that is?
That's hard. I would absolutely rather have Little Rock than nothing, 100%. And Little Rock is amazing because of those Talos missiles. No other museum ship has anything like that. The missile hangar spaces, I'll call them for lack of a better word. Magazines is probably the accurate word, but it's more like a hangar than a magazine. That is we didn't save any other like Cold War era missile type ships like that. And so it's so unique. That said, that's not at all my area of interest. I grew up loving World War II and the base design World War II ships. So probably if I had to choose one, it would be like a Columbia or a Montpellier, one of those two hard fighting Cleveland class cruisers that then wasn't too heavily modified post war.
Would you?
I think Columbia was modified post-war, but like if one of those historically significant ships in her more or less base configuration.
You're right. No, that's understand. Well, and so that's where kind of my answer comes in. So my favorite USN cruiser would have to be Des Moines, or in this case, Salem.
I thought we were limiting ourselves to World War II, like that World War II design ship, a post-war build. Man.
Okay, so
the
Baltimore. Okay, so Baltimore happens. Then they realize, okay, we can make improvements. So then Oregon City happens, where it's like the same basic ship, but we trunk the funnels together and get the pyramid superstructure, and the anti-aircraft battery gets beefed up, and
which arguably makes a better fighting ship, especially in anti-aircraft, but a much more cramped ship. Now with all those uptakes inside the superstructure, less exterior superstructure volume, and more magazines for anti-aircraft guns.
Well, so and then remember, so the Navy is projecting a fight off the Japanese homeland, home islands for 1945, 46, 47. Who knows? I mean, this is a group, a country of people who could potentially just, obviously, we talk about the land invasion, and who knows. And so, the Navy is expecting thousands of land-based aircraft to just fly themselves at ships. And so the late war cruisers all become anti-aircraft cruisers. It doesn't matter what it is. So everything from Atlanta through to the light cruisers, through to the heavy cruisers, all become auto-loading, dual-purpose ships. And then that's how you get Worcester. And you would even see a Group 4 Atlanta build, eventually. And a lot of people forget this, but the 8-inch guns are dual purpose.
Yeah.
And to be dual purpose, they have to have a certain fire rate, so they're auto loading, which makes it really fun against, when you think about it, against other enemy vessels. But they're really that way to pump out anti-aircraft shells.
And there's a chance that Newport News actually shot down a jet aircraft during the Vietnam War.
See, so
with her 8-inch guns.
Yeah. And so what's really interesting about those ships is that Salem, especially Salem in this case, since she's the only, but that, unlike we were just talking about Little Rock, Salem is preserved in that 1950s, like post-war. So
it's all World War II technology.
Yeah, all the 3-inch 50s, and all the guns are still there, and it is preserved. So it kind of makes up for the fact that Little Rock is a Cold War missile cruiser now, not a Cleveland class light cruiser.
They complement each other very well.
Exactly. And so some of the elements that you're missing from Little Rock, you can go to Salem and still see.
In an earlier episode, we were talking about what ships make great museum ships. And unfortunately, cruisers are the least preserved.
Which is strange, because you think how many cruisers there were versus how many battleships. But I think, as you know, the propaganda piece that is a battleship or any sort of, or a carrier, any large capital ship like that.
I have a theory on this. The battleships, one, they're just that order of magnitude bigger. They're a little bit more visually impressive, but they're named after the states. So you've got the financial backing of this entire state to support.
That's very true.
Starting out a museum ship. The state of New Jersey spent millions of dollars to bring the battleship New Jersey there, for example. The cruisers are named after cities. So at best, if their city is one that they can actually get to, that's the size of the principality that is going to be willing to financially support you. And so they really have a hard time of it. And We certainly see those sort of maintenance issues with Olympia, which is a massively historically significant vessel, both because of she's the last representative of that engineering time period and her historical significance, and yet she doesn't have nearly enough financial support for the maintenance that she needs.
That's a much older ship too, built at a period where you see what Texas is going in, and Olympia obviously is even older than that, so that gives you sort of an idea. So part 2 then. So, well, is there anything that you would? Okay, so real quick before we move on. Is there anything that, so you talked about the Cleveland class of light cruisers. Is there anything that you would like to have seen preserved, taking out Alaska? I would like to have seen an Alaska class ship preserved. Okay, let's get that out of the way. But is there anything else?
Basically be brand new in the packaging.
Yeah, exactly.
Important cruisers that should have been preserved.
Like, I would say it would be nice to have an Atlanta.
Yeah,
still around, just simply because those are unique ships in that they're big destroyer leaders, and they have a destroyer main battery, but there's a ton of guns hanging off of it, and they're all kind of.
I would have liked to have seen a treaty cruiser of some sort. The treaties obviously hugely important during the interwar years. And those treaty cruisers are the ones that have the really heavy wartime experience because they were there since day one.
Yeah, they were there in those battles, in 1942, when all these other ships that we're talking about were barely even off the ground or being built or even concepts in the future. And, they were the ones who were initially taking the brunt and the losses.
And unfortunately, most of them get scrapped immediately post-war because we've got so many Baltimores and Des Moines
but what's a New Orleans compared to a Des Moines?
Yeah, barely a step on the evolutionary chain towards that. Despite the history, so the concept of preserving a museum ship wasn't even there yet. Now that said, some of the Brooklyn class light cruisers do soldier on in foreign navies up into the 80s and possibly even later than that. So if one of those could have been acquired and brought back, or even preserved in whatever second country they were being used by, Argentina or wherever else we were giving them away, it would have been great to have kept those.
Well, exactly. So now moving on to part 2, non-USN. Is there a cruiser that, luckily, obviously when we did the battleship episode, we talked about, the Royal Navy not keeping Warspite or Vanguard, what have you. But we have Belfast, which is it fits this, so that's fine. And I think that was a good ship to keep, representative of that class.
Absolutely.
And I think, actually does a very good job at that. So is there another British cruiser, or are you going somewhere else for this? Because this go ahead.
Well, for the British, I would have probably saved London as an example of the county class. What a hugely important class of cruisers that was. And I think London was probably the most modified, but she was also the one that was kept in service longest, if I'm not mistaken. My British cruiser knowledge is nowhere up to British battleship knowledge or American cruisers, unfortunately.
That would be one of those instances where you mentioned cruisers being named for cities.
Yeah.
Well, so in this particular case, it's the same deal, but could London ends up potentially where Belfast is in London, and so you kind of have this draw that works in its advantage.
And then maybe Belfast gets to go home.
Yeah, exactly.
In this instance.
Right.
Let's see.
Well, do you have a favorite non-USN cruiser before a museum pick?
Okay. Favorite non-USN cruiser. I didn't put enough forethought into this.
No worries. So
you want to go with yours?
My answer is Prince Eugen. I think the Admiral Hipper class is in the same way that the Admiral Hippers and the Bismarck class ships look a lot alike. And that was actually, in sort of the Battle of Denmark Strait, through binoculars from that kind of range, the ships have very similar silhouettes. And in this particular case, Prince Eugen was leading, and when the Brits had last spotted them, Bismarck was in the front. And so they switched positions, and so then they look, and then the ships look the same, really. They both have the same, 2 turrets in the front, 2 turrets, a little bit of superstructure, a funnel, and sort of a secondary bit. And so that's why they open fire on Prince Eugen first, because they think that's Bismarck in the lead, and then they realize that's not the case. So anyway, so those ships look a lot alike, but I think the Admiral Hippers are just gorgeous. And I'm going to say Prince Eugen versus specifically over the Admiral Hippers, because obviously the Admiral Hipper comes out of the originally launched with kind of the stubby bow and doesn't later on, and so Prince Eugen, I think she looks the best out of her sisters, and of course Blucher doesn't last very long. And
no modifications to that ship.
Yeah, exactly. That's embarrassing. But then the fact that she does survive, she has a full war career, does survive, and again, as we discussed in the battleship video, is expended during the nuclear test, versus, she ends up being taken into the U.S. Navy, gets hull number and everything. And in one of those, in a brief moment, you could say, could this ship end up like U-505? Could this end up as, instead of being nuked, it goes on like some sort of, end of war tour, like in American cities, and then is turned over? Or is it just any German? Well, we can't say that because U-505 still exists, but, is a large German heavy cruiser capable of being saved, or was it always going to be nuked?
I think she could have been saved if she didn't come to the United States. The United States really only took the ship that we had no use for to keep it out of Soviet hands.
Yeah.
And if she had gone to the Soviet Union as a frontline vessel, that they were even trying to acquire a ship of that class during World War II.
Well, they did.
Partial.
Okay.
An incomplete one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
complete enough. The fourth. So the. Yeah. Okay. What becomes Petropavlovsk is at the end of the war can't be finished by the Russians, and is kind of kept around for a little bit and then ultimately scrapped because they can't finish it, and they don't have parts for the German machinery that's ultimately installed. So anyway.
Yeah, and then at the end of the war they end up with reparations of an Italian battleship. They've been given a British battleship as part of Lend-Lease, American cruisers. So I think that if they had have gotten their way and gotten Prince Eugen, that would have been a very powerful ship in the Soviet fleet, and she may well have been retained as a warship for a while, since she was relatively intact, and they had this other Hipper class cruiser that they could trade parts from the two.
That's true. You could then go back the other direction and pull parts off of that hull for Prince Eugen and keep that around. My only concern would be if you look at sort of Giulio Cesare as an example, that became Novorossi.
Don't ask me to pronounce it.
They let that ship go. Like, they painted it, sailed it around, and obviously that ship was much older, and had been rebuilt even by the Italians into what it was in World War II. Because if you look at like the original Conte de Cavours, they're like, so that ship had already gone through multiple revisions. But I think that Prince Eugen would have ended up just like that ship.
There's a strong chance, and that's not the only one. Whichever R-class battleship Great Britain had given them is given back in such a terrible shape that she's immediately scrapped. Not that she was frontline anymore. Yeah. The same for Murmansk, the Omaha class cruiser that they had. They get the aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin nearly complete, and they just sink her rather than doing anything with it.
We could do a whole episode on Graf Zeppelin. I have so many things.
So there is certainly precedent for that ship being lost. there's also precedent for these Soviet cruisers being preserved to the present day. So I think that was Prince Eugen's best chance. And when she's captured, or when she's given to the United States as a reparation war prize, that really seals her fate, even though the United States has the biggest tradition of saving ships as museums.
I mean, and even for them to move Prince Eugen around, and this is a functioning vessel. Like, it's not like the ship had been scuttled and razed, and this was a fully functioning unit of what was left of the German Navy at the end of World War II, and it still needed the original crew needed to be retained in order to work on the fiddly machinery, because it was so bespoke, and the U.S. Navy was like, I don't want to deal with this, and it was still hard to maintain, even just in the little bit being sailed out to Bikini or out to the Pacific. So yeah, it's understandable.
I feel like the Soviet Union would have had less qualms about retaining the crew that dropped her off.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, held them at gunpoint. Like, exactly. Any of the Japanese cruisers, like for instance, like an Otago or even like Tone or something like that, I think would be interesting.
I absolutely love all of the Japanese cruisers. I believe Japan had the best cruisers during World War II, certainly the best heavy cruisers.
Well, the cruiser really was built into this Japanese doctrine, and it served a very specific role. And then
and they built their navy around their doctrine. They designed their ships for their doctrine, unlike the Kriegsmarine, which
we're just making it up as we go.
Yeah, exactly. They've got a pretty good commerce rating doctrine.
Yeah.
They're designing ships to operate as a battle fleet, and they want to move in that direction. But then they get in a war before that and have to revert to the commerce rating doctrine with ships that weren't designed for it.
Yeah. And then we switch to U-boats, and by then it's too late.
You've wasted all the resources that could have gone into dozens of U-boats, both in crew and the metal for these ships, in these prestige symbols that are useless in your doctrine.
Well, we talked about Graf Zeppelin. It's you make the investment in what in like 1939 is probably one of the largest and most capable aircraft carrier platforms like in the world.
Certainly in Europe.
Obviously, the Japanese have these large Pacific fleet carriers are sort of a different story, and obviously Lexington and Saratoga are quite large too. But for the European theater, I mean, Graf Zeppelin certainly is, I would best, a lot of the British carriers. And so you make the material, the monetary material investment in a ship that ultimately gets to like into the 90s percentile worth.
You're like 5% away from having a complete aircraft carrier.
And it's basically just the infighting within the Nazi party and Goering just being like, no, all aircraft need to be Luftwaffe. Like the Kriegsmarine cannot operate its own aircraft. Something the Japanese and the USN have just gotten over at this point. Like, we're done with this conversation. And that infighting prevents, they even went and built naval versions of 109s and Stukas. They built the actual airplanes, and it's just all this political Nazi infighting, and you have this massive investment sitting there, and it just goes to waste. And the Soviets tow it out, shoot at it, and it sinks, and that's the end of that.
There are stereotypes about German efficiency, and this is not an example of that. This is an example of like feudal lords infighting.
It's just ridiculous. Like, oh, if the Kriegsmarine gets airplanes, then suddenly Goering won't look as good to the Fuhrer. It's like, dude, get over yourself. But then again, if they made good decisions, then we wouldn't be where we are. So anyway. Okay, before this spirals out of control.
Going back to the Japanese cruisers, Tone was the last one left. She is sunk by American aircraft right at the end of the war.
Exactly. Yeah.
She's also the last Japanese warship left from the attack on Pearl Harbor. I think there's an argument to be made to preserve that ship.
Now, of course, by that point in time, all these ships were just laid up in port because they didn't have fuel and ammo and everything else. And then, a bunch of Avengers would come in and just kind of sink them in shallow water. And there's a picture of Tone just kind of sat there, half sunk.
And then maybe even worse, the United States comes in afterwards and occupies the country. So are we going to raise this and turn into a memorial? This Pearl Harbor ship?
No.
That really kills her options.
No, you're going to be turned into a bridge that we we shelled,
Yeah.
or a factory that now needs to make Toyotas. So yeah, exactly. So I think that answers most of the question. As always, we'd love to hear from you. What cruisers do you all like, and what cruiser could be presented as a museum ship today? We'd love to hear from you.
What if Achilles was still down under?
Yeah, Australians there were some few options there, but anyway, love to hear from you in the comments. Make sure like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.